Welcome to our Curious Amalgam, the weekly podcast brought to you by the Antitrust Law section of the American Bar Association. Our Curious Amalgam explores the fascinating and increasingly overlapping world of competition, consumer protection, data protection, and privacy law. Each week, we bring you leading global experts on the most compelling issues of the day. Enjoy the show.
Welcome to our Curious Amalgam. This is Alicia Downey, and today's episode is called Will It Make Any Difference? Government Cases Against Google and Remedies Here and Abroad. Competition enforcement authorities all over the world are bringing cases and enforcing new rules against the Big Four: Google, Apple, Facebook, and Amazon. Different jurisdictions are imposing widely different penalties and restrictions on these companies, and sometimes it's debatable whether the remedies are having the desired effect. So what's the proper fix? Obviously, it'll be different depending on the company, its platforms, and reach. But is there anything in the various countries' approaches that could be characterized as best practices to end the real or perceived abuses of dominant platforms? We're talking today to an expert in such matters, the former General Counsel of one of Google's leading competitors, DuckDuckGo. We'll be discussing what to consider in designing antitrust remedies involving platforms with a particular focus on Google and search engines. My co-host today is Melissa Maxman. Hi, Melissa.
Hi, Alicia.
Would you introduce our guest?
I'd be delighted. Megan Gray is a terrific lawyer and a terrific friend of mine. She is an advocate focused on information, internet innovation, and intangibles. She has a wealth of experience immediately prior to setting up her own boutique law firm again. She was General Counsel and Vice President of Public Policy at DuckDuckGo. She was also a senior attorney at a top 100 law firm, senior counsel to the Federal Trade Commission's Bureau of Consumer Protection, and, as I said, has her own boutique firm now, in which she works as a foreign correspondent as well as within the U.S. borders. She has negotiated complex commercial contracts, litigated precedent-setting cases, and lobbied governments around the world. Welcome, Megan.
Hi, thanks for having me.
We are delighted, and we're going to just dive right in. Let's start with describing the problem. What are the government, and when I say government, I mean U.S. v. Google, but also the state attorneys general v. Google. What are their allegations against Google, both in the U.S. And can you talk a little bit about what, if any, parallel proceedings are happening abroad?
Well, the problem is pretty self-evident, right? Even with doing this podcast, we had to all join via Chrome, which is owned by Google. It was set up using Google Calendar. We use Google Docs. Google is everywhere. It infiltrates every aspect of your daily life. Now, the cases, depending on what jurisdiction you're in, are looking at different aspects of that. You've got here in the United States, the main federal antitrust case, which is focused on search, general search. You've got the state cases here in the United States, which is focused on online advertising. You have investigations in the UK, in Russia, in Turkey, in Germany, in the EU, in South Korea. Everybody is looking at a different aspect of the Google problem.
Is there a common theme, a common thread?
Yeah, it's interesting. The common thread is that Google is just so inescapable and so intrusive. They've got email, they've got Android phones, they've got the predominant browser, Chrome, they've got YouTube, they've got online ads, they've got search, they've got shopping, they've got analytics, they've got Nest, they've got Maps, Calendar, Docs, Local. They are the internet, at least in terms of consumer interactions. And the theme of that is, well, how did that come to be? And how is it that, innovation is stymied and competitors are stymied and consumers are in the long run harmed by this massive dominance by Google. And then we spent the last decade evaluating whether that's a quote unquote natural monopoly. And I think all the people who have been looking at that have determined that no, that is not natural. And once they start digging in through discovery and their investigations, they realize it definitely is not natural. That is a result of, for example, the $15 billion that Google pays to Apple to be the default search provider on iPhones.
So let's focus on search. I mean, as you noted, there are so many tentacles that Google has. We could focus on almost anything, but let's focus on search right now because that's what the US v. Google case is about. Also, that's what, from your experience at DuckDuckGo, and I know you can't disclose anything that's proprietary, but from your experience, what makes it unnatural? We've heard a lot of talk about scale. What does scale mean to a competing search engine?
Well, there's a couple of different ways that when folks talk about scale in search, they're talking about different things. In one respect, it can be the breadth and depth of the index that underlies the search engine, all the websites that are cataloged, and all the information associated with those, the popularity of those websites that are in the index, which is called in the industry click and query data, so that you know where a search result should rank, if it should be at the top, if it should be on the 5th page, and so forth. So there's that kind of scale, which is table stakes for running a search engine. You kind of have to be able to deliver good search results. Another aspect of scale is the advertising that makes that a profitable search engine. And that's a separate case that the states are running. It's not really part of the federal case, but it is a necessary component of any effective remedy that you'll have with Google. How does the advertising fit in?
In other words, how important is the advertising to a competitor? Well, let me step back 2 steps. Who are the main competitors to Google search?
The main competitors are, depending on how you look at market share, they don't have any competitors. Google has 98% of the search market, folks, 98%, and that is durable. It's been 98% for 10 years. So if you put that aside and then say, well, who are the competitors for the remaining 2%? There are hundreds of search engines, hundreds. You haven't heard of them, of course, because Google, again, has 98% of the market. But there's Bing, which is owned by Microsoft. That has a significant market share of that 2% because it is the default in Windows machines. And then you've got DuckDuckGo, of course, which is most well known for being the private alternative. And then you've got Ecosia, which is out of Germany. They donate money for trees. You've got Shazam out of Czechoslovakia, which has a lot of litigation in Europe and has been very active fighting against Google for a long time. There's just hundreds of them. Every time I turn around, there's a new one. So,
what about Yahoo? I've heard that Yahoo has a competing search.
Yeah, I suppose so. They used to. Now Yahoo is really just Bing.
Given that the ubiquitous Google has such an overwhelming market share of search, how are consumers and competitors affected? What's the harm? What's the complaint?
So this is the one respect that I think podcasts make it difficult, because I'd love to be able to show a visual here to show you what a search results page looked like on Google 10 years ago and 5 years ago and today. And it is just so striking. They used to have the search result that you were looking for at the top of the page. Now, if you're lucky, it's at the bottom of the page. And you have all these intervening ads and Google properties that they try to divert you off to. So you're not getting an unbiased, objective result. So like consumers, that's really the preeminent way that consumers are harmed, is that it's supposed to be a search engine. It's not supposed to be a turnstile to lead you down further Google business lines. And so you've got that, just the results. You've also got innovation. So there used to be a lot of innovation, a lot of different business models, a lot of different search engines that would try to compete for what is the best possible way to serve the consumer. That's how Google entered the scene. I don't know if the listeners are old enough to remember what search engines were like pre-Google, but I do. And Google was way, way better. But you haven't seen that continued innovation since then.
I have to say, let me just speak for the older user. I remember where you had to do Boolean searches to search for things on the internet. Google was a complete game changer. I am fully in the clutches of Google. I have noticed the changes over the years. So, I mean, from my perspective, I guess I would be most curious. I know we're going to get to this later. What would any restrictions placed on Google look like, to me as the user? Is that going to cramp my Google style?
It's a great question. Nobody wants to lose out on the internet or, good search engines. But there's not a trade-off. So one other thing that I just want to point out is where consumers have lost out is on privacy. So it used to be that Google did not collect and store and string together all of your searches and create this massive, very revealing profile about you and make assumptions about you that are persistent across years. Now they do. So it doesn't have to be that way, but Google has found that to be very beneficial to their other business lines, particularly in the online advertising market.
Tease that out a little bit. Why is it so beneficial to get a comprehensive picture of any user?
Well, I don't think it actually is, but Google has convinced advertisers that they have an accurate profile and predictive ability of my purchasing inclinations. And therefore, Google can charge a premium for their advertisement.
So, for example, during the pandemic, when I bought my cordless vacuum, which everybody was at home all the time and I could not stand my carpets. And then I started getting adverts for cordless vacuums every time I logged on to anything. Is that because
Absolutely.
Google knew?
Absolutely. Okay. That is exactly why. And I just want to say that is what you see. That is what is visible. That is the tip of the iceberg. Okay. Imagine how much is below the surface of the water that you are not seeing. They are making assumptions about you. They have all sorts of affinity data associated with that. You chose a certain color of a vacuum cleaner. You got one of a certain battery power, of a certain price point. You bought it from a certain vendor. All of that goes in and is used to flush out the profile of you and your family and your friends.
Sounds creepy.
Yeah.
So why should I care?
Because
I don't have anything
information is used to design your experience. What you see. Have you ever watched The Truman Show? That's a great movie, and that's what I like to point people to, because it really is how it works nowadays with the online experience and increasingly offline. So that the advertisements that you see for jobs, the websites that are suggested to you, the offers and coupons and discounts, the prices for airline flights, all of that is influenced by this profile that is collected on you and then shared with other businesses.
Are you saying that that the end users are harmed, or are you saying that competition is harmed?
It's both.
Okay.
I think it's almost impossible when you have that kind of dominance and that kind of money that is generated from that dominance, right? That it distorts not just your individual online surfing experience, and not only the ability of other search engines to innovate and compete successfully, but also governments. The revenue that Google has now is greater than many countries. It is almost impossible to underscore how influential that kind of money can be and how corrosive it can be to a functioning democracy where we're trying to do what's best for the public as a whole.
So are you saying that big is by its very nature bad?
It can be. It certainly can be. I mean, that's true for anything. It's the same thing as power. Power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts, right? It's not necessarily against antitrust orthodoxy to say that in some instances big can be bad, because we can all imagine a situation where a company is so dominant and so rich that it really is not good for a country.
Well, and that would be in the nature of blocking innovation, blocking competitors from joining
blocking information, furthering information that is false. There's all sorts of ways that it can disrupt a society.
So let's turn to remedies. There's been a lot written about remedies here in the U.S., and I think there can be a lot learned from what other countries are in fact already doing while the wheels of justice grind on to a 2023 trial date in the US v. Google case. Let's start with remedies that would help even out the market share. In other words, allow Bing, Google, Ecosia.
Right. I think actually that's one of the challenges that we have in the United States, is because we're supposed to create remedies that are very siloed and very closely tied to the specific allegations in an individual complaint. So you've got the US v. Google search case. Well, really, to have an impact there, and you can have some impact, but it's going to be very difficult to really accomplish and achieve the outcome of diversifying market if you're just looking at that one case. I think that it's very smart in the United States that we have these two parallel tracks, and hopefully soon a third track. So the first one being search and Google paying off Apple to get the default. The second is the moneymaker for Google, which is the fact that it is predominantly an online advertising company. That's the fuel that creates the opportunity for everything else. And then the third is privacy. If we could get really good privacy legislation passed, then that would also help bring Google down to a manageable but still very successful company. And what you're seeing in other countries is this same thing, where nobody's come up with the right remedy yet. Everything is still chugging along, and everybody's taking a little bite here and a little bite there, when really the Google problem is an entire ecosystem. And if you try to just do a little bit, it's like a balloon, and you squeeze on one side and it's just going to balloon out larger on another. You're not actually going to be solving the problem for very long at all. So in Europe, they had the shopping case. They have had the Android case. And they're looking at other aspects, and they're doing the DMA, the Digital Markets Act. And they've got GDPR, which is some privacy, which is starting to see some actual enforcement now with Google Analytics. So you've got a bunch that's going on, but nobody that has comprehensively tried to tie all this together yet.
So in the Android case, what happened? How did that play out?
In Europe,
Yes.
It's on appeal right now, so it's still playing out. But because Google did not settle that case, the European Commission and Google collaborated to come up with a kind of remedy. And it's very different than in the United States, where the antitrust violator is supposed to come up with its own remedy. And Google, which is very well known for understanding how auctions work, came up with an auction remedy that, of course, completely favored Google. And fortunately, the competition folks in Europe figured that out, made them stop. And now you've got a less nefarious but still horrible, quote unquote, solution on the Android case, which is a half-assed preference menu that is shown once when you first purchase a new Android phone.
And so what would improve it from the perspective of a competing search engine? What would improve that remedy?
The best analysis that I've seen was out of the UK. The Competition and Markets Authority did a deep dive on Google search, and they came up with some very, very good ideas that unfortunately they have not pursued to date. One is a preference menu type solution, which makes it so that Google cannot have the default search setting on Android or on Apple phones. Also requiring Google to license its click and query data to other search engines so that there will be an opportunity for more competition. And then also taking into account privacy dimensions. I want to address for a minute some of the other ideas that we've heard in the United States with breakups. I don't know that breakups are going to be the solution here. I do think it needs to be looked carefully at. But if you have, for example, a situation where Google is forced to sell off Android, and that's the only thing, that just means that the new company Android can sell the default to Google. So you've got to have some additional mechanisms in there to make sure that what you're accomplishing is actually accomplishing what you're trying to do.
In terms of what you've been reading from academics, competitors, basically pundits on what would be the best remedies, and I don't know if you've heard the comparison of what they did in Turkey versus what they did in Germany versus what they could do in the United States. What have you heard? What's been out there in the dialogue? Which
I'll tell you one thing that's been out there that hasn't been reported, and okay. I find this very interesting, is that Google has already been forced, both Google and Apple have been forced to implement a preference menu on phones. Russia is the very first place where this has been required in an antitrust case, and nobody in the United States has reported on it.
Wait, so Russia is requiring?
Russia has been requiring since last year. No iPhone sold in Russia can have Google set as the default.
So a consumer would have to buy it and then go on and pick its search?
Correct.
Okay. Has that had any impact on market share in Russia?
I don't know. Presumably it has. I mean, I assume that the reason why that happened was because of Yandex. Yandex is a search engine that's popular in Russia. Oh. Right? One of the hundreds and hundreds of search engines that I mentioned that most people in the United States have never heard of.
Now, so what happens if we get a patchwork of worldwide remedies?
Well, what if? That is almost certainly what is going to happen.
Okay. And,
so what will happen is eventually Google will have to make some business decisions about what it can do that is not a patchwork, because it's not really sustainable, even for a company like Google, to have 152 different operating systems, for example. So hopefully, even with it being paper cuts, with 1,000 different paper cuts, it will make an impact.
How long do you think this is going to take?
I think it's going to take a long time. Unfortunately, the The cases are going slowly. People are still trying to get their arms around what's going on. Technically, it's very hard to understand. Just trying to understand the online advertising market is like a full-time job. That is incredibly complex. I think the most likely outcome is that Google wises up and realizes the long game, they're not going to win. And they ought to try to figure out some sort of compromise earlier than that. That might open some opportunities.
When you say long game, I mean, are we talking decades or years?
Yeah, I do. I think so. If you're just waiting on litigation and consumers individually acting and potential legislation, more than 10 years, definitely.
So how do you respond to the argument that consumers really don't care about privacy? And they vote with their feet, right?
That argument is just insane. Of course they care about privacy. You know, the argument is, do they care enough to change their behavior, right? And I agree that is very questionable. It is hard. It is very hard. You have to get on with your day. You need to take your child to the dentist. You've got to pick up your mom from the hospital. You've got to answer to your boss. You've got 400 emails. Like, you don't have time to be fiddling with all of these different settings and carefully scrutinizing the pop-up boxes. But just because you clicked accept all cookies doesn't mean that you're cool with that. It just means that it's another instance of you trying to get on with your day and resenting big tech. I think that part of this has led to the populist movement is because so many people feel like they have no choices in big parts of their lives. And big tech has definitely given us that impression.
Well, you may be right about that, Megan. Thank you. This has been very informative, and I know it's a topic that many of our listeners are interested in. But before we let you go, we like to ask a couple of questions of every guest on our Curious Amalgam. The first of these is, tell us something interesting about yourself that we would not know if we only knew you professionally.
I had kids all on my own. So when I was 35, I decided to have kids, and I just had kids on my own.
Well, that's great. How many?
2.
And what are they doing these days?
They are annoying me. That seems to be their job these days. They're 16 and 13.
Which is a diagnosis.
Yeah.
All right. Now, if they were to become interested in going to law school and becoming lawyers, what advice would you give them?
They have no interest in becoming a lawyer. They think lawyers work way too hard. Now, advice for people who are young lawyers, I would just tell them to not listen to any advice, really, when it comes right down to it, because I think every person's situation is so individualized and it's very hard to generalize. The best advice is know yourself. Know yourself really well and try to figure out what makes you happy and map out how to get there.
I agree. How about you, Melissa?
Oh, yeah.
And for the final segment of the show, we're going to play a little game we call the Curious Hat.
And now it's time for the Curious Hat.
All right, we got the fun music on. Here's how it works. You'll pick a number between 1 and 10. I will pretend to draw it from a hat because we're doing this virtually, and there is, in fact, no actual hat. So please, Megan, pick a number.
1.
Number 1. All right. That question is, what do you do for fun in your free time?
I don't know that I have had free time in a long time, but I have many plans to have fun. I want to play pickleball. I want to start swing dancing again. I like reading books. I like cooking. So in an ideal world where I have free time, these are the things I would do.
All right. Well, I hope you get some time, and I hope you do those fun things. Thanks again for being on our Curious Amalgam, and everybody join us for next week's episode.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of our Curious Amalgam, a competition, consumer protection, data protection, and privacy law podcast. It is produced and shared around the globe by ABA's Antitrust Law Section. The opinions expressed by the participants in this podcast are their own and do not necessarily represent their employer or other organizations. If you like what you heard or would like to become a member of the American Bar Association, please check out what the Antitrust section has to offer at ambar.org/antitrust. You can learn more about our podcast at ourcuriousamalgam.com. If you have comments, suggestions, or podcast ideas, please reach out to us at podcast@ourcuriousamalgam.com. Until next time, thank you for listening.